Today we're going to be learning Sukkah Daf Tet Zayin. Today's daf is dedicated by Mark Goldstein in honor of his wife, Rena Septi Goldstein, on her birthday. With love to my life chavruta. Mazal tov. Okay, what we saw yesterday, we were talking about the arukot hamita, the boards of the bed. And then we said that maybe since you can't use the boards of the bed because they're susceptible to impurity, maybe that would support Rav Avi Bar Tov Yomi's line that sechacha b'blai kelim psula, that if you use the remnants of a utensil, a worn out utensil, it's not allowed because it's still susceptible to impurity. To which we said, no, it must be that we're talking about not a board that was just taken out of a bed on its own, but it was a board with two legs. In fact, I'm going to pull up pictures for today, and I'm going to show you that we then said, why is a board with two legs? Here's the picture. Why is a board with two beds relevant? Why is it still considered makabel tuma? And we quoted a source that said that Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with the rabbis about it, and the rabbis had said it's mitamet evarim and mitaheret evarim. Even in parts, it can become impure and can be done toveled in the mikvah. And then we had Rav Hanan in the name of Rebbe, who said that we're talking about either the long board with two legs, and that's what you see in this picture here, or a short board with two legs, which would be the other part of the bed from the narrower part of the bed. So here's a picture. The Gemara then asked, okay, this is at the top of our page on line number 5, line number 4 and 5, Lamai chazia, for what is this relevant? Lemismechinu aguda, to attach it to a wall or to put it next to a wall, ulemetav alayu mishta ashle, and to put it on a wall and sit on it, right, using these ropes. So here's a picture just so that you can envision what exactly this means with the ropes. What they did here was they attached another board to this long board, meaning coming from the wall. Here you see there's an indentation in the wall that the board sits on. It goes into our board, which is parallel to the wall. And then on those three, we now have 3 boards because 2 coming out of the wall that come onto our board with the 2 legs. And then, right, all you need basically, once you have these 2 legs, all you need is 2 more boards that go into it. You can string some ropes on it, and then you can attach it to the wall here. They also have hooks that connect the other ropes to the wall. It's actually not the easiest contraption to come up with, but you could build something like this, and therefore it's considered a utensil. And that's why it's susceptible to impurity, and not because of anything inherent in this item, because it was once usable, even though it's not usable anymore, it's still susceptible to impurity. That would teach us about blai kelim. No, it doesn't, because that's not the situation. Now the Gemara says, Gufa, let's go more in depth into this line of Rabbi Ami Bar Tov Yomi. Amar Rabbi Abi Bar Tov Yomi, Schacha biblai kelim psula. If you used these remnants of utensils, it would be disqualified. You can't use that for a sukkah because, again, they still retain their status of susceptibility to impurity. My blai kelim, what is blai kelim? What's an example? Amar Abaye, matlaniot she'em behem shalosh al shalosh. We're talking about little pieces of cloth that are in 3 by 3 tfachim, 3 by 3 handbreadths. Okay, this is actually no. Shalosh al shalosh is etzbaot, is fingers. Okay, it's not the width of 3 by 3 fingers. I just want to double check that. Right, it's 3 by 3 fingers. That is the smallest possible cloth that one could use, because even a poor person will use something that's 3 fingers thick by 3 fingers thick. Okay, so to lochazim, by the way, how do you know it's etzbaot? How did I realize I made a mistake? Because shlosha would be tfachim. This is just simple Hebrew grammar. Tfachim is 3, etzbaot would be shalosh. Okay, so therefore, shalosh al shalosh etzbaot, shlosha al shlosha tfachim. This, by the way, is another way to distinguish between tfachim and amot, because amot is feminine, so the word would be arba amot, arba'a tfachim. Okay, that's how you know which one it is, when it often just says the number without saying what they're referring to. So matlaniot she'em behem shalosh al shalosh de lo chazian lo la'aniyim v'lo la'ashirim. So you have a piece of cloth that came off of your shirt, ripped off your shirt. It's less than 3 by 3 fingers. That would be what we would call blai kelim. Now we're going to have a braita that supports Rabbi Ami Bar Tov Yomi. Tanya kavatei Rabbi Ami Bar Tov Yomi. Machzelet shel shifa v'shel gemi. Okay, you have some sort of mat of reeds. Shiareha, the remnants of it, even though they're less now than what it was originally, Okay, here we see, even though the mat is now much smaller, it ripped, it's still not used for schach. Now you might say, wait, a machzelet is a mat of reeds. Now we use mats of reeds for schach. So how could this possibly be? So now you'll see why. So in other words, we already have our proof, because here's our proof for Rav Avi bar Yomi, which is if you had something that was bigger and then it's smaller in size, it tore, parts of it came off, it's still going to be susceptible to impurity. You can't use it as schach. But now we have a separate issue, which is how can you possibly use a mat of reeds for a schach? How can you not use it? That's exactly what people use, right? They take these right? I remember when I was a kid, we used to use bamboos. We'd have big pile of bamboos that would be tied together. We'd schlep them to the sukkah and we do one by one. We put the bamboos in the sukkah, right? No longer do we do that, right? It's much easier now. I'm sure different people do different things. In my house, we just roll out the mat. Still not so easy because we have a gigantic sukkah and the mats are very heavy, not only to mention they're impossible to get back into the bags that they came in. They have to be rolled very tight, but still it's a much easier process. So now, machzelet hakanim gdola mesachachim ba. If you have a large one, you can use it as schach. Now, this is very interesting. Why can you use it as schach? Okay. So Rashi says, I think Rashi says it. Let's see. Delav klihu. Okay. If it's so big, it's not really usable for anything. Tistama l'sikuch. Think about it. What's a machzelet used for? In Israel, it's very common. You take a machzelet, a mat of reeds, and you bring it to the beach, right? I'm sure in other places it's common as well. Now you wouldn't have a huge one that fills your schach, right? That the truth is it might, but let's just assume, okay? The point is that usually a machzelet, a small one, is used to sit on, is used for all sorts of purposes. But a big one that you would use for your schach, you wouldn't use for anything else, right? I'm thinking of my big sukkah. I would never take one of those mats of reeds. First of all, it's very heavy. I would never schlep that to the beach. Would be impossible, right? I wouldn't use it for that. So what Rashi is saying is, it must be that if you have a really big one, it must be designated for schach. If it's designated for schach, it's not called a utensil. It's for schach. And obviously, if you're making it for schach, it's not going to be susceptible to impurity. But it's kind of like a funny logic because it's saying, because it's a utensil that's used for schach, it's not susceptible to impurity, right? But what it really means is, what does it mean usable? Usable is to use to sit on, use to cover something, right? This is just for your sukkah. It's not usable for other things. Therefore, it's not susceptible to impurity. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, okay, he disagrees and says, no, it is also, even a large one is susceptible to impurity and you can't use it for schach, right? So he would have issue, I guess, with the things that we use, unless somehow you would call what we use not exactly a mat of reeds. HaChotet bigadish. Now we're back to this case of chotet bigadish. Okay, I'll show you a picture. Okay, although you'll see in this picture, they already have it a little bit differently. So I'm going to share it from a better place. Okay, here's our pile of straw. Okay, you'll see something at the bottom. We'll get to that in a minute. So chotet begadish, what did we say? If you hollow out this pile of straw and you make yourself a sukkah inside, it's a problem because you didn't create the schach for the purposes of having this space underneath for us to sit in. So now they say, Amar Rav Huna, Lo shanu ela she'en sham halal tefach b'meshech shiv'ah. This is only if you don't have actually, let me share it even. I opened it here. This is where I wanted to get to it from. Okay. This is only if you don't have a space of a tefach underneath. Let's say you built this pile of straw on top of, here they have, for example, a piece of wood underneath. And underneath that, I don't know exactly, you would have to have it, I don't know, let's just assume. You build it under this piece of wood and there's a space of a tefach. There's airspace of a tefach. Now, why is airspace of a tefach important? A handbreadth? Because, and by the way, let me finish reading this sentence. Ein sham halal tefach b'meshech shiv'ah, for a length of 7 by 7 tefachim here. If underneath this pile of straw, I have a space that's 7 by 7 length and width and height of a tefach, then already I have 7 by 7 is your minimum size for a sukkah. A tefach is your minimum height for a sukkah. Now, it's not really true. It's not your minimum height for a sukkah, but it is a height that's considered ohel. Remember, we've talked about this when it comes to tumat ohel, right? If I have a dead body, if there's a tefach of space above, then the covering over it becomes the law of ohel, tent. So that means that if I have this space underneath, now we also saw before, if you remember, that when we talked about a sukkah on top of a sukkah, there were three opinions about what the minimum height of that sukkah needs to be. And one of the opinions was a tefach is enough. And this is another space where a tefach comes in, where a tefach already has significance, even though it's not really, no one can live in that space, but it already has the minimum requirements for this being considered some sort of tent. Right? A sukkah in essence is really a type of tent. So he says, this whole thing about chotei begadish is a problem is only if she'ein sham chalal tefach b'meshech shiva. If you didn't have a tefach of space underneath, that was 7. But aval yesh sham chalal tefach b'meshech shiva, harei ze sukkah. That means when your schach went up, you already had the minimum requirement for something to be considered a tent. So when you put your schach up, there was actually a tent. You created a tent underneath, and therefore your schach would be considered ta'aseh. It's not something that was already created, because when you created it, it already had a space of OL. Okay, now you might say, right, good, this isn't a kosher sukkah though, right? So I'll give you an example. One of the commentaries connects this to the case where, if you recall, we had a sukkah where it was 9 tefachim high and you dug down a tefach. And we said, as long as it's within 3 of the walls, we can view it as if you created a wall of 10 tefachim. Now that happened after the schach was already in existence. If you recall, I told you, we discussed that first your walls have to be up and then your schach. But what we're learning here is that your schach has to be put up. It doesn't have to be put up on fully kosher walls, meaning they have to be long enough when you put them up. As long as you have a wall and some space and you've created a tent out of this, even if in our case, right there, it was 9 tefachim high. And then you later created the ground, right? You dug to make the wall higher. In this case, you started off with a tefach of space. So you had a bit of a wall structure with a tent and some airspace. Your schach went on top, even though it was this huge pile, but that's enough. Okay, according to Rav Huna anyway, that's enough to make this considered a proper sukkah, that you really did put the schach on top of this space. It would have to be that you were doing it for the purposes of shade, right? He doesn't really talk about that, but it would seem that that would have to be. Otherwise, remember, we talked that the schach has to be put up there for the purposes of shade. So that's a little bit of a question to Rav Huna, because it doesn't really seem like someone was putting this pile of straw for the purposes of shade. Tanya nami hachi. Okay, now we're going to have a braita to support this. Hachotet begadish la'asot lo sukkah, harei zeh sukkah. So now they say, okay, here's a braita that says, this is against our Mishnah. If you're chotei begadish to make a sukkah, it is a sukkah. And our Mishnah said it's not a sukkah. So now the Gemara asks, don't we have in our Mishnah, ain't a sukkah? Elalav shma mina, it must be that we can infer, kidei Rav Huna, as Rav Huna says, shma mina, meaning. Then they brought up this contradiction between the braita and the Mishnah. And then we said, it must be that one is where there was a tefach of space that was in a space of 7 by 7 handbreadths. And that's like Rav Huna. And that's why that one was a good sukkah, but our Mishnah didn't have anything underneath and therefore not. Some people learned the sugya differently, the same exact thing, the same conclusion, but they learned it in a bit of a different way. That first it started off with this contradiction. And what motivated Rav Huna to say this? It's because he saw that it said, and then they questioned, right, that was our Mishnah. If you hollow out this pile of straw, it's no good. But Hatanya, then they brought up a braita that says harei zo sukkah. It actually is a good sukkah. And then Amar Rav Huna, in order to resolve the contradiction, as opposed to bringing this contradiction as a proof for Rav Huna, in order to resolve the contradiction, they said, Lo kashya kama sheyesh sham chalal tefach b'meshech shiv'ah, kama she'en sham chalal tefach b'meshech shiv'ah. And then the answer was, it depends whether it had a space of a tefach 7 by 7 or it didn't. Okay, new Mishnah. Hamishal tfanot milamala lamata. Now we're going to start talking about all types of walls. Again, I'll pull up the pictures. We're in picture number 89. If you take walls and you build your walls top down, Okay, some people say mishalshel. I think Rashi says it is hitchil la'arog hamechitza. Rashi dibor matchil milamala lamata. You started to weave the mechitza from the schach going down. Okay, the assumption is your schach wasn't there yet, though. Okay, because again, you have to have a wall before you start putting your schach on. But if you build your walls from top down, the point being that you never actually get to the ground. Okay, you can see from this picture here that your wall didn't make it all the way down. So you start weaving a wall, right? Weaving your cloth down, and right, im gavoa min haaretz shlosha tefachim psula. If you don't make it within 3 tvachim of the ground, again, this is our law of levud, that if it's within 3 tvachim of the ground, we view it as if it's attached to the ground. And that's what we saw before, because the gedi, a little goat, can't come through here, right? That means it's protected enough from, creatures, right? Maybe not teeny creatures, but normal sized creatures, right? Even small ones can't get through. But if it's more than 3 tvachim off the ground, that's not considered a proper wall because it's breached at the bottom. Animals can come through. It's a problem. So if it's more than 3 tvachim high, psula. Milamata lamala. Okay, what if you're starting from the bottom and you start weaving your wall up? Im gavoa 10 tvachim kshera. So as long as you get to 10 tvachim, that's fine. And this is what we say. Okay, we learned this. It doesn't actually have to reach the schach. Okay, we said for 2 possible reasons. One is we say good asik mechitza, which means we imagine that the wall goes up, and it's enough. As long as you have a 10 tvachim wall, we can imagine the rest of the wall going up. It's as if it reaches where the schach goes. Or alternatively, we saw the Ran thinks there is no such concept as good asik mechitza by Sukkah, and he explained that what's the issue here? Once you have a 10 tvachim wall, who says the wall has to touch the schach? It doesn't. You need wall. You need schach. They don't have to touch each other. As long as you have a 10 tvachim wall and above it somewhere there's schach, right? As long as it's not 20 amot off the ground, as long as above it there's schach, that's sufficient. So therefore, if it's gavoa 10 tvachim kshera, either because of good asik mechitza or possibly not, just because you have a good solid wall. Remember, 10 tvachim is our minimum size for a wall. Rabbi Yossi omer, keshem shelamata lamala 10 tvachim, kach milamala lamata 10 tvachim. Okay, he basically says this first sukkah, picture 89, is totally fine, even if it's higher than 3 tvachim off the ground. All you need is a 10 tvachim wall. We don't care about gdim, bokim, bo, about animals going through. That's not an issue here. The issue here is you need a halachic wall. It doesn't matter if it's attached to the ground, not attached to the ground. Again, attached would mean within 3 tvachim of the ground or not. It doesn't make a difference. So now we're going to come back to Rabbi Yossi out, right? We're now going to have a question about what the debate between them is. B'mai kamiflage, what's the root of their machloket? Mar savar mechitza tluya materet, umar savar mechitza tluya ena materet. So Rabbi Yossi says a hanging mechitza is totally fine. Now, why? So first of all, again, you could say you have a kosher wall. What's the difference? But also we have this concept of good achit mechitza. Good asik is to go up. Achit is to go down, like nechita, a landing. So, right, when you talk about planes, they land, nechitot, you call it landings. So now nachit is to go down. We view good achit mechitza as we can also view the mechitza as going down. If you remember, we had cases like this in Eruvin, where we allowed certain things with these hanging walls. So now he says a hanging wall is allowed. And Mar Savar mechitza tluya eina materet. And the rabbis, Tanakama, say, no, that's no good. Tanan hatam. Now we're going to quote a Mishnah that comes up in Eruvin. Okay, we learned this. So now the Mishnah in Eruvin says, Bor sheben shte chatzerot. Okay, you have a pit. Okay, here we're going to move to picture 91. You have my house, my courtyard. Your house, your courtyard, we have a wall in between both of ours. Okay, you see this all in picture 91. We have a bore, a pit or well, a cistern in between both of our properties. Now, what's the problem? The water mixes. We have a wall between us. We haven't made an eruv, so we're not allowed to carry from my property to yours. What if, can I take the water? Now, the water, what's the problem with water? Water moves. So I could be theoretically taking water that's from your side if I go and take water out of this cistern. So we say, you can't fill up from here on your side because you might be taking from the other side. Unless you built a 10 tvachim wall. Now you have this wall in between our properties, but it's the pit, the cistern is underneath that wall. So you have to build an additional wall going down. We're now going to see a machlokes Beit Shammai Beit Hillel about how this wall has to be situated. So it has to be a 10 tvachim mechitza. Okay, that's our minimum requisite amount for a wall. Okay, how this is explained, most people read it as, and there's a bit of a different girsa in Eruvin, whether it's above or whether it's below, meaning below, well, there's different ways to understand this. I'll give one explanation. Below meaning it touches the water, above meaning it's not touching the water. Some people think below means it's actually in the water itself, goes submerged into the water, or whether it's lamala, which means it sits on top of the water. But the main thing is bein b'toch ogno, as long as this mechitza is within the opening, the rim of the cistern. So if, right, as you see in this picture, right underneath the mechitza that exists between both our properties starts the wall, and at that same height is where the cistern starts, right? It's underneath our mechitza between our, right, don't confuse the two mechitzas, the mechitza between our properties. Underneath that, we build another mechitza that's within the opening of the cistern. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether it's submerged in the water, not submerged in the water, or reaches the water, doesn't reach the water, as long as it's within the cistern. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, I think I said it was machlokes Beit Shammai, right? So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Beit Shammai omrim milamala, Beit Hillel omrim milamata. Beit Shammai says you can even do it above again, meaning probably above the level of the water. And Beit Hillel omrim, which could either be above not reaching, or above reaching the water, but above the water. And Beit Hillel omrim milamata, which either means it has to touch the water, if Beit Shammai thought it didn't have to touch the water, or milamata means it has to go all the way down into the water. So this obviously is creating some sort of, now still the water can move from one to the other, but since we have this submerged, right, somehow within the cistern, this mechitza, it's okay. So again, according to Tanakama, it doesn't matter if it's milamala lamata, as long as it's within the opening of the cistern. According to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, machlokes Beit Shammai Beit Hillel, whether it needs to be milamala or milamata, again, but the assumption is no matter what, it still has to be within the airspace of the cistern. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, third opinion. Lo tehei mechitza gdola min hakotel shebenehem. Here comes Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. He says, why do you need this additional mechitza? We already have a mechitza that's above right now. It's true, it's above the cistern, but what's the difference? It's right over the cistern. That mechitza between my property and your property, which doesn't actually go into the space of where this pit, the cistern is, it doesn't matter because we have a wall that's a proper wall. And basically, what do we call this? Mechitza tluya. It's as if we can imagine as if that wall goes all the way down into the cistern. So Amar Rabba Bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yehuda b'shitat Rabbi Yossi Amar Amar Mechitza tluya materet. This is exactly what we just saw of Rabbi Yossi. So he says, Rabbi Bar Chana says, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi are the same opinion because he says Mechitza tluya works in Eruvin, and Rabbi Yossi says Mechitza tluya works by our Sukkah, right, which is picture 89, that we view this wall as if it goes down. So both of them are viewing walls as if they go down. So let's see if it's really the same or not. The Gemara rejects what he says and says, Velohi. It's actually not the case. Why is it not the case? Lo Rabbi Yehuda savar like Rabbi Yossi. Velo Rabbi Yossi savar like Rabbi Yehuda. Neither really holds by the other. Why? We're now going to have, one is an issue in Eruvin and one is an issue in Sukkah. And each one's going to say, we're going to say according to each one, I think it's only true for Sukkah or it's only true for Eruvin. Rabbi Yehuda savralak Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda wouldn't agree with Rabbi Yossi. He'd say this is only true in the Eruvin case. Why is that? Because an Eruv between my courtyard and your courtyard is only derabbanan. Really, what's the problem? On a Doraita level, you can't carry to a public domain. This is not a public domain. It's my neighbor's domain. So it's true that the rabbi said, well, you can't, but it's only rabbinic. So therefore, we can allow this hanging mechitza, right, this imaginary mechitza to basically say, we view it as if it goes down. But here, it's sukkah. That's a de'oraita halacha that you need a proper wall. That's not going to work. We can't use a hanging mechitza for that. Below Rabbi Yossi safar like Rabbi Yehuda. Now, why wouldn't Rabbi Yossi, if he holds it by sukkah, which is de'oraita, he should of course hold it by eruvin, which is only derabbanan. But now we're going to bring logic of a different sort. You could say that Rabbi Yossi only said it there, ela b'sukkah, di mitzvat aseh. It's just a mitzvah aseh. What do you mean just? Well, we're going to see. It's a mitzvah aseh, and you want to be able to fulfill it. So we'll allow you to fulfill it in this manner. Aval Shabbat, isur skila lo. But we have to be much more careful when we're worried about overriding a prohibition. When it comes to Shabbat, even though this is only rabbinic in nature, but if you allow this, right, then maybe you'll allow it into a public domain, and you're playing with fire, so to speak, because there's a prohibition here, and the prohibition eventually could get you to be stoned, right, which is very serious. And therefore, we're going to treat Shabbat more seriously than we'll treat Sukkah. So two different models. Is it Doraita Rabbanan, rabbinic Torah, or is it the prohibition versus positive commandment, right? Negative commandment versus positive commandment. Ve'im tomar, but wait a minute. But wait a minute. We had a case where we permitted a mechitza tzluya on Shabbat in Sipori. Now, Rabbi Yossi was a rabbi in Sipori. So was it not based on Rabbi Yossi that they allowed a mechitza tzluya? In a minute, we're going to see what the case was. And therefore, it would seem that Rabbi Yossi does say it in a mechitza tzluya case, on Shabbat even. That he holds mechitza tzluya not only works for Sukkah, like our Mishnah, but would also work in Shabbat. So they say, no. LLP, Rabbi Yishmael, but Rabbi Yossi, it was his son who permitted it, not Rabbi Yossi himself. He would not have allowed it because, again, we tried to suggest that he would only say it in Sukkah and not by Shabbat. Umayma said, what was this case that happened? When Rav Dimi came from Israel, Amal, he told us, there was a time, one time they forgot to bring, people would keep the Sefer Torahs in their house. It's very interesting to learn some history here, which is the Sefer Torahs were kept in their houses. And they forgot to bring the Sefer Torah to the shul before Shabbat. Now we'll see in the picture in a second, let me pull it up, that the Sefer Torah was in a house that was in the same courtyard as the shul. Okay, but they didn't make, right? There wasn't an eruv, a proper eruv, or walls. It was all open to other houses as well. So what did they do? Lemachal, on Shabbat, what did they do? Persu stinim al gabeha amudim. You can see this from the picture. They put up two beams with a cross beam going across, almost like a clothesline, and they threw sheets over it. Now, the assumption is, you can't see from the picture. The picture is actually a bad picture. But the sheets didn't go all the way down to the ground. There was a lot of space underneath, but they functioned here as proper walls. And then they basically ended up enclosing this area between the courtyard and the shul, or between the house and where the shul was, to create as if it was one courtyard. V'kal ubo. So, ve'heviu Sefer Torah v'kal ubo. And then they brought the Sefer Torah to the shul, and they were able to read from the Sefer Torah in the shul. So now they say, Persu sakadatach. So now, wait a minute. How could they have done this on Shabbat? Mehechan hevium b'Shabbat. How could you thought that they put the sheets on Shabbat, but where did the sheets come from? They had to bring them from somewhere else. How could they have done that? Ela matzustinim. Oh, it must be matzustinim prusim al gabe amudim ve'vir sefer Torah b'kavub. How did they put these sheets over it? It can't possibly be. Where would the sheets have come from? By the way, in Eruvin, they ask another question. It's hard to see really the way they did it in this picture, but it's possible that the stinim created some sort of ohel, like a tent kind of formation. And then there they ask the question, how could you build an ohel arai on Shabbat, a temporary tent you can't build on Shabbat? So how did they build this on Shabbat? How were they able to put the sheets over? Again, it sort of depends on how you view this picture. It's one of the downsides of pictures that they don't show you all the options of how exactly this could have looked. But our sugya says, where would they have brought the sheets from, right? The assumption is, what's the problem? Even if you brought it from the shul, you brought it from the house, the whole point was this courtyard is forbidden because it's a shared courtyard with the shul and the house, and it's jointly owned, and therefore no one can carry there. So there's no way even to carry the sheets out. So therefore they assumed the sheets were there from before, and it was already on the it was already hung over. And they said, oh, look, we can use this as a wall to basically block in the space and consider it all one space. Okay. Amar Rav Chisda Amar Ravin. Next halacha. Now we're going to talk about different types of minimum shiurim for sukkah. Again, we get back to what's the minimum. We're going to assume right now that we're talking about a 10 tefachim high sukkah. So your schach is at a height of 10 tefachim. And now we want to know we've talked about minimum walls, right? Well, you could have 2, and then the third one only has to be a tefachim width. But now we're talking about height of the wall. Height of the wall, we already learned, has to be 10 tefachim high. But now we're going to learn that physically you could actually accomplish this with much less. How so? Laws of levud. Remember how levud works. Anything less than 3 handbreadths from the ground or from possibly a higher spot is going to be considered levud. We view it as if it's continuous. So therefore, Rav Chisda says the name of Avimi. If you're looking at the picture, you can already see where this is going. Picture 93. Machzelet arba'a v'mashu. If you have 4 and a bit, and you place it exactly centered in the height of this 10 tefachim sukkah, materet b'sukkah mishum dofen. This is permitted as a wall. Because why? If it's 4 and a bit, you basically position it, right? 4 and a bit plus a little less than 3 and a little less than 3 is going to be 10. So therefore, position it where you have a little less than 3 to the top. We say levud. We view it as if it goes to the top. A little less than 3 from the bottom. We view it as if it goes down. And there you have a full-fledged halachic wall. So hechi avid. You position it in the center, right? Less than 3 from the top, less than 3 from the bottom. Anything less than 3, kilavud dami, is levud. To which the Gemara asks, Pshita, isn't that obvious? Why are you telling us this? It's quite obvious. So now they say, here's an interesting thing you might have thought. You might have thought we only say one levud. You can't use levud to go in 2 directions, right? This comes out this ridiculous thing. You're going to have this teeny little wall, and you're going to say that's as if it covers 10 tefachim. So therefore, they said it so that you know that you can use levud in 2 different directions, and that works. However, Gemara is now going to bring a contradiction. Meitive. Next picture, 94. Machzelet shiv'a v'mashu materet b'sukkah mishum dofen. If you have a mat and you put it on your wall and it's 7 and a bit, that permits your sukkah mishum dofen. Now, why? Why would you need 7 and a bit if you could get away with 4 and a bit? So it doesn't make any sense. So what did they answer? Kitanya hi b'sukkah gdola. That doesn't contradict because that's talking about a large sukkah. Here we mean large in terms of height. That sukkah, remember, I started off by telling you it's 10 tefachim in height. You can't use laws of levud if it's more than 3 away from the roof. So if you put down this 4 and a bit, and the roof was 15 tefachim off the ground, you wouldn't be able to say levud because levud only closes the gap. You can't use it. It's true, we said before, that as long as it's 10 tefachim high, it doesn't actually have to reach the schach. But you can't have it say, well, it's less than 3 away from the height of 10 tefachim, even though there is nothing at the height of 10 tefachim, because your schach is, let's say, at 15 tefachim. So therefore, you can only use levud when you actually have the schach right there. So therefore, in a tall sukkah, you'd have to use this, and then we're going to see that it's telling you that you could put it 7 and you put this 7 and a bit, less than 3 away from the roof, wherever the schach is, and that works for din of levud. So now they say, right, then that would work. But that's not the same as our case. Umay kamashmalan. So then they're going to say, so what is this teaching us? Is it teaching us? And the way they understood this is it's teaching us you can put a 3 away from the roof. It's obviously you could put a 3 away from the floor. Everybody knows that because that's classic din levud. You certainly wouldn't need to tell us that. So they're assuming this halacha is teaching you, even if it's higher than 3 off the ground, right? Let's say it's 5 off the ground, 6 off the ground, whatever. And then you put this 7 and a bit, then it's within 3 of the ceiling of the roof of the sukkah. It works, but that's Rabbi Yossi's opinion in our Mishnah. So why would you be coming to teach us something that it says in our Mishnah? And also, is this only according to Rabbi Yossi? Okay, then they're saying that what's this coming to teach you? That you can have a hanging mechitza, meaning we say good achit mechitz, we can view the wall imaginarily as if it drops to the bottom, like Rabbi Yossi. Okay, that's what they're assuming this means. Okay, so that it's really an answer. The Gemara is saying what they meant to tell you is exactly this. Sorry, I said as if it was a question. It's really an answer. It's saying they're trying to tell you that we hold like Rabbi Yossi that you can have a sukkah at a certain height off the ground, and it only needs to be 7 and a bit as long as it's within 3 of the schach. Last halacha for today, Amar Rabbi Ami, pas arba'a v'mashu. If you have, now here we're talking the other direction. Instead of here, we were talking about horizontal walls, right? 7 and a bit horizontally or 4 and a bit horizontally. Now we're going to have a wall, a standing up wall that's 4 tfachim wide, but height of the sukkah. So if you have a board that's 4 and a bit, matir b'sukkah mishum dofen. Okay, this can permit your sukkah. It can be used as a wall. Again, assuming your wall is, let's say, 7 by 7. So 4 and a bit is less than 3 away from the wall because the wall has to be 7. Laws of Lavud. It's as if your sukkah covers the space. Umokim labepa, and then he says, and you'd have to put it, mokim labepa chomish losha samuch ledofen. You'd have to put it within 3 of the wall. Anything less than 3 away from the wall is lavud, and that works. My kamashmalan. So what is this coming to tell you? Don't we know this? So it's saying, oh, ha-kamashmalan, shi'ur meshach sukkah ktana shiv'ah. Oh, this was really coming to teach you something else. It was coming to teach you, since it's going to be 4 and a bit within 3 of the wall, it's coming to teach you what's the minimum size of a sukkah. Remember, we had a debate. Is it rosho v'rubo, Beit Hillel, which would be 6 by 6 handbreadths, or Beit Shammai, who says rosho rubo b'shulchano, his head, the majority of his body and his table, which would be 7 by 7 tefachim, or Rebbe, who said it's 4 cubits, which is a much larger amount, right? Almost 4 times the amount of Beit Hillel. So we say, this is to teach you that we hold like Beit Shammai, and this is further proof that we hold like Beit Shammai, that it's 7. And that's why they give this shiur, the amount of 4 and a bit, to say if that's within 3 of the wall, altogether you'll have a wall of 7, and that will be sufficient for your sukkah, because that's the smallest possible sukkah you can have halachically. With that, we'll finish, and we're going to start with the new Mishnah in tomorrow's shiur. Have a great day, everyone, and Shabbat Shalom.